We're so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining this important discussion. Before I go ahead and introduce our panelists, I just want to quickly set the stage. So again, this is the third webinar in our Support Squad series, and it's a two-way street. Why good communication matters for everyone. So my name, if you haven't met me yet, my name is Jordann Phillips, and I will be your host this evening. I am a co-founder and currently serve as the board chair of Be Present Foundation. We are a nonprofit working to improve the quality of life and health outcomes for young adults with cancer. So we do this by strengthening connections between these young adults and their communities of support. And as you can imagine, a large component of this involves clear communication between survivors and their supporters. So I'm particularly excited about tonight's webinar topic. But again, before we dive in, I'm so excited to introduce our speakers. We have three incredible experts here today to share their knowledge and wisdom with you. But I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So the session is being recorded and it will be available via replay after the webinar is over. We'll provide a link on our website and it's going to be free for you to review at your leisure. And please feel free to share it with friends and family that might not have been able to make it live here tonight, but would benefit from watching in the future. So if you have any questions as we are going through this webinar, please feel free to enter them at any time into the Q&A box down below, into the chat if you feel called to do so, and we will take time at the end to answer these. So without further ado, I'm excited to have with me today Juli, Colter, and Brendan. They're all here to share their unique thoughts and experiences as not only survivors, supporters, health professionals, cancer advocates, but also nonprofit professionals and experts from academia. So I will now let each of them individually introduce themselves because I couldn't do them justice. So first, I'm going to pass it over to Colter if you feel comfortable, and we'll get started.
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Colter Ray. I'm a professor at Louisiana State University, and I also do some consulting and training work with a wonderful organization called Empathy Boot Camp. And my whole career is really focused on how can we help people become better supporters of people who are going through cancer. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know what to say, or they say things that are not helpful, or they say nothing at all. So my job is to figure out where the breakdown is and how we can fix that and make sure everyone's doing a better job supporting each other through that difficult time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colter. Next, we have Dr. Juli Fraga. Juli, love to hear about your background.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Juli Fraga. I'm a psychologist. I'm also an assistant clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And like Colter, I'm also a trainer with a great organization called Empathy Boot Camp. And so in my work as a psychologist, I support a lot of families and a lot of parents who are facing health concerns and just helping people to weather just some of the emotional roller coaster that can come when we face tough times. And, you know, especially looking at how we can use our own insight as kind of a catapult to help us communicate better. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. And then last, but surely not least, we have Brendan McDonald. So Brendan, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan McDonald, and very briefly, my story is I was a humanitarian aid worker for around 20 years at the United Nations and NGOs, and in early 2015, I was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia and went through treatment for that, ups and downs. And when I was first diagnosed, I discovered the difficulties associated with talking about cancer with friends, family, particularly at work. As a result of that, I wrote a book called Glossary of Awkward, which is talking about the difficulties communicating with cancer. And I started a company, or co-founded a company with my wife, Corinne Gray, Uncomfortable Revolution, looking at issues around communicating about chronic illness and disability.
All of y'all's work is so important. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to tap into your collective knowledge. I have no doubt this will be a juicy discussion. So to set the stage, if you're an audience member listening in, you're probably already getting excited. But whether you're at the point right now of hearing cancer news for the first time, which we all know can be really heavy, really traumatic, if you're in the middle of the cancer experience itself, or perhaps you're at the point where you're trying to figure out what's next after treatment, we hope this webinar will answer some of your questions and really open the door to conversations that you might be struggling with, because that's something we've all been there. And so we are here today because we strongly believe that with a commitment to improved communications, your support and connections will be that much more stronger and more meaningful, thus improving the cancer experience for everyone. So to give a preview of what's to come over the next 90 minutes, this webinar will cover 3 major topics. We hope that you'll stick around, but again, if not, the replay will be available if you miss anything. And so first, we're going to go over how and why cancer changes our ability to communicate and connect with others, whether you are the survivor or the supporter. Then we're going to dive into why clear communication is so vital when asking for and offering support. And then the last part of our webinar, we'll talk about tips and techniques that you can utilize in your own life and experiences to really overcome the barriers that exist and avoid mistakes that we so frequently make, to become more empathetic and mindful communicators, especially when it comes to cancer. So as noted, at the end, we'll leave time for Q&A to address your questions, and we'll follow up on any open topics from the discussion. So I don't know about y'all, but I am ready to dive in. So first, again, talking about just how and why cancer really changes our ability to communicate and connect, even though it's really like this invisible thing. And so Brendan, wanted to pop it over to you first. And you noted that you started Uncomfortable Revolution in response to your own personal experience, with your wife as a patient and survivor. Can you describe kind of your experience with friends and the communication and connection after diagnosis? Particularly, I think it'd be interesting to dive into, were there any revelations about your experience that caused you to just say, this has to change? Like we have to, get uncomfortable.
Yes to all of that. Like every person who's diagnosed with cancer, when you first hear those words, you have cancer, no matter what the time, it's a shock. For me, very quickly, when the doctor said you have leukemia, for the next 10 minutes, all I heard was blah, 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 blah. It just sunk in. It didn't sink in, sorry. So I was working with the United Nations at the time, and I didn't know what to do or who to talk to about it. So for about 24 hours, I pretty much kept it to myself. But when I got to work, I spoke to my best friend seeking advice. And I said to my friend, I've just been diagnosed with leukemia. And he said, I had a friend at school who had leukemia. I think they died. Are you going to be okay? And it was like, oh, that wasn't the reaction I was expecting. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I certainly wasn't expecting to hear that, especially when I was still trying to digest what it meant to have leukemia. Mm-hmm. And then there was a series of similar conversations with friends, family, work colleagues. I saw the United Nations doctor to talk about the issue, and he said, Brendan, do not tell anyone, and I mean anyone, you have cancer. If you do, your career is finished. Another dear friend said to me, why would you want to put chemotherapy in your body? It's chemicals, it's going to kill your cells. Have you tried, alternatives like turmeric? And there's a whole succession of these things, and it just made me very irritable because I felt the conversation was very often about them, or trying to center them in the story rather than about being supportive to me and what my needs were. Mm-hmm. And then, to cut a long story short, some time into my cancer diagnosis, I was telling some people about my experiences having the conversations, and people said, why don't you write a book? So my wife Corinne and I wrote a book called Glossary of Awkward, illustrated by a guy called Simon Kneebone, which successfully launched on Kickstarter, and people connected with the book and said, hey, this is really about the difficulties of talking about cancer. And then we realized that actually wasn't just about cancer. You know, there's a whole range of chronic illnesses, from epilepsy to cerebral palsy, where people have a disability and people feel really uncomfortable talking about disabilities and chronic illness. So we found there was a common theme about communicating around these issues, and that's why we started Uncomfortable Revolution.
Thank you so much. I can relate to that feeling of not knowing what to say, but then not saying anything at all when my friend was diagnosed. And it's really, that's why we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. But again, the name of this webinar, it's a two-way street, is because it requires us to really have empathy, which we're going to get into. And Julie, I know I want to pop it over to you next, because in hearing your experiences, Brendan, I can't help but think like, oh, if only those people had empathy for what you were going through, if only they could put themselves in your shoes and like truly understand. And even if they don't know what to say, hey, that's, you know, I don't know what to say here. I feel uncomfortable, or whatever that is. And so Julie, a cancer diagnosis, it often creates this like artificial barrier, and sometimes these awkward comments and statements, which might be well-intentioned, come from that awkward barrier. What are your thoughts on like how we can shift that, how we can develop some of that empathy? And are there certain like social maybe stigmas or phenomenons that are similar to that we might be able to relate to?
That's such a great question. And I think that a diagnosis of cancer, anything that is vulnerable that maybe we don't face all of the time, can make us feel really uncomfortable, because we could feel a lot of different things about it. We might feel anxious, we might feel scared, we might think oftentimes when somebody shares their tough time, I think unknowingly, depending on how we're wired, we might think that our job is to kind of help them find a solution, or kind of to fix it. It can help to just have a little pause, you know, to think of when was a time you felt really vulnerable and scared in your life, and what did you maybe need from someone else? You know, chances are you might not have needed them to fix it at all. Maybe you just needed them to listen. And I know, you know, in our work that Colter and I do with Empathy Bootcamp, one type of empathy that we talk about is cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is the ability to kind of put myself in the mind of the other. So for instance, if Brandon and I were friends and he said, you know, Julie, I just found out today that I have leukemia, you know, I might feel really sad about that, but instead of kind of rushing ahead with my own, you know, feelings, I might pause and say, gosh, Brendan found out he has cancer today and he feels really sad. I wonder what sadness feels like for him. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that can give us enough of a pause so that we can then check in with the other person. So
what other types of empathy do y'all work with at Empathy Bootcamp that you like wrestle around?
Those are great questions. So there's another type of empathy, which is called effective empathy. And that's probably maybe the type of empathy many of us can relate to, because that's kind of like, oh, you feel sad about something. My friend feels sad. I feel sad. So that's kind of feeling with the other person, mm-hmm. which is certainly one component of empathy. But what we know through research is that people that are higher on effective empathy, especially maybe if they're getting stressed or it's something that's anxiety provoking, that can lead maybe to a little bit more of what we call empathic distress. And so you need a combination of both effective empathy and cognitive empathy to have kind of an empathic response. And Colter, feel free to weigh in, you know, also and add anything.
You're doing a great job. I mean, yeah.
Is there anything
empathy? So yeah.
I was going to say, is there anything, so when you kind of put yourself in that mindset, leveraging the cognitive empathy, is there the ability to, because I can imagine that part of that, response could be somewhat overwhelming, as you were kind of just talking about with the other type of empathy. Is there a way to like mitigate that response and really help us kind of not guard ourselves emotionally, because vulnerability is important, but understand that the experience of the survivor in that moment needs to be prioritized? And how do we kind of balance those two experiences that might be very different in the moment?
No, that's such a great question. I think one thing that can be useful that we talk about is to just kind of, give yourself a little pause, wait 3 seconds, before you check in with the other person, and then start with what, we might call it in empathy boot camp, an empathy starter. So that might be something like, I'm really sorry to hear that. How are you feeling right now?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you just feel like you don't know what to say, or you're overwhelmed, to just be authentic and honest. I don't know what to say. I feel really anxious. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, or I'm beside you, maybe to check in with, what are some ways that we like to convey empathy that come kind of naturally to us, just as somebody might be really extroverted and be really great at small talk. Oftentimes there are different kind of gestures, maybe somebody who drops off food for somebody else, who helps organize something, or checking in. What are kind of empathic gestures that kind of align with who you are as a person? And when you can identify those, empathy doesn't feel maybe like such a, I don't know, as thorny or kind of complicated in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it does make sense, because what just came up for me is that, cancer hopefully isn't something that a lot of us have to touch a lot in our lifetime. And so I want to go back to something you said, which is that we can, put ourselves into a time that we've experienced that maybe it was scary or unfamiliar. And really, because I know with Kirsten, when she told me that she had cancer, I was like, I've never dealt with this before. Like, what? This is so unfamiliar, so foreign. And so would love to just, pass it to anybody. Is there a way to, really maybe like I know we're going to get to techniques and tips later on in this discussion, but for those listening in who may be dealing with this for the first time and it seems so scary and like untangible, what ways can they maybe relate it to other experiences that are unfamiliar or scary that they've maybe previously gone through? Because I can imagine that all of the responses, whether that's physical, mental, emotional states, like are probably going crazy and flaring up.
Yeah, I mean, I can take this. I think a part of that is one of the best ways you can mitigate the maybe potentially awkwardness of the situation is to just engage in some meta communication and like communicate about the communication itself, and be like, if you're the person with cancer sharing that, just to say, I know you probably don't know what to say, because maybe this is the first time that you've had this, and this is the first time that I've gone through something like this too. And just to have that moment of it just kind of breaks down the walls, right? Like, instead of everyone trying to put up this facade and say just the right thing to support the person and play it up, if you just say, look, like, I don't even know what I need right now. I'm just letting you know this, and you don't have to be like the perfect supporter for me, but I just need you to literally be present and to be here with me. Like that, even that will be enough of a direction for that person to be a better supporter.
That's really helpful. Brendan, I want to ask you, because I can imagine when your friends, your family members gave you this feedback, it was probably really jarring. And so I think, now you've done all this work and really, understand the complexities of communication. But for those listening in who maybe, they're on the survivor side where they're feeling like, oh no, I responded to this poorly. How can I bridge that gap now? Can you maybe relate to their experience and what they're going through, and just kind of offer any type of reassurance or validation for that experience from your perspective?
Yes, sort of.
Okay. I love that. Yes.
I think early on, and of course, I'm not a big fan of the word cancer journey, but everyone's diagnosis is different, and people's prognoses are different, and their personal circumstances are different. And one of the things that I found early on with diagnosis is I also had a lot of anger and confusion myself. So I felt angry at people who didn't get it. And, and as Colter and Julie mentioned, even perhaps people are doing all the right things and doing cognitive empathy and so on, it doesn't mean that's going to connect with the person who has cancer. I might be immune to someone who's expressing empathy because I'm so absorbed in my own moment, I have no time for anyone else. So I think people have to acknowledge that there is going to be awkwardness, and there might be times where, in hindsight, you think back about those conversations you had early on with friends and family, and maybe your response wasn't textbook nice or appropriate because you've just been told you had cancer. It's a fairly difficult thing to go through. So I think one is you have to forgive yourself and understand that miscommunication will happen. But something that I guess, Colter with his studies has probably explored is that over time, I lost a lot of friends, or maybe I should say colleagues, because in the early days, you think you have a large support network. But when you are diagnosed with cancer, because of the uncomfortableness around the topic, people tend to drift away. So those that stuck with it and remain good friends, even if there's awkward conversations, I have a lot more connection with than perhaps people who said the right thing early on, but then drifted away.
Yeah, I mean, I can absolutely attest to that just through my own research and my own work, is that we tend to see a cycle or a series of cascading effect of actions whenever someone receives kind of unwanted or unhelpful support. And, there's that emotional reaction. Maybe you are angry with what the person has said or what they've done because it doesn't meet your expectations. But then from there, you also start to reevaluate whether or not they're the type of person you want to reach out to for support in the future, as you maybe find out more news about how your treatment is going or if there's a change in your prognosis. And so you start renegotiating that friendship or that relationship. And you maybe even at some points, like you mentioned, Brendan, is you maybe even choose to cut someone out of that circle of supporters, essentially. And you realize it's just not worth sharing information with this person because they just aren't doing anything for me as a supporter. And then the other side of that equation is exactly like we mentioned, is people unfortunately ghost each other whenever there's a cancer diagnosis. And sometimes it's because they don't know what to say. And sometimes it's other reasons as well. But that's something that was surprising early on in my work, was the number of people who just said nothing at all, and they just left that relationship just out to dry at a time whenever someone really, really needs support. And so that's been a heavy but interesting topic to continue to investigate, and interviewing dozens of cancer patients every year. Unfortunately, a lot of what you just said, Brendan, is echoed time and time again. Just that's a common experience, which means it's an opportunity for all of us to address that and figure out how do we figure out how to get people to not just leave a relationship, a friendship, or a work relationship just because of the potential for awkwardness. And it seems like it would be easy enough, but it's not. It's an extremely complex thing to approach.
And that's why we're here, and that's why we're having this discussion. And so now that we've laid out, some of the problem and what's going on in a very real experience for many of the cancer patients, or survivors rather, that we work with, that y'all work with, would love to talk about just the importance of clear communication when asking for, offering support, how to overcome some of these barriers that we've talked about. And Colter, something that would love to kind of, it's a I guess, tag along to what you just said. This webinar really is talking about the communication being a two-way street. And so it's particularly with the difficult conversations in the face of tough circumstances like a cancer diagnosis, or the work that you do where good or poor communication really changed the treatment trajectory and health outcomes, or kind of just any examples you can pull from of like, this worked really well, this didn't, and how it really took both parties being invested in making that connection.
Yeah, I love the communication as a two-way street analogy or metaphor. And because the state of things is that it's a two-way traffic jam, is what it really is. And one of the most striking things I came across early in my research as a professor was when interviewing a cancer patient, one of them kind of hit a breaking point. And they said, you know what, just at the end of the day, these people, as in her friends and family, these people just don't know what to say. And then about a week later, I was interviewing someone who had chosen not to reach out and provide support to someone they knew with cancer. And that person at one point had a breaking point and they said, honestly, I don't know what to say. And even if I did know what to say, I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to approach it. So you have this impasse on both sides of the street. There's that barricade is there. And like I mentioned earlier, I think at some point, someone has to just go for it and start the conversation, right? And so if you are realizing that a certain friend or colleague that you really want to hear from hasn't reached out to you, feel empowered to reach out and say, hey, I'm going through a lot right now. It would be really great to hear from you or just to catch up and to chat about it. And then on the other side, if maybe you finally have built up the courage as a supporter, you can reach out to the person and really put the ball in their court in terms of scheduling, saying, hey, I know you're going through a lot right now, but let me know if there's a time in the next week when we can catch up. And if that person keeps on kind of passing it back to you, then you can maybe try to be a little bit more assertive about when that conversation happens. But some of the like basic things that are the chief complaints that cancer patients routinely espouse about like their supporters is they don't show up, or when they do show up, they're overbearing and they are more they're more telling the person how they feel instead of giving that person a chance to actually explore their emotions and to like share what they're going through. So you sometimes have what we call like the happiness warriors, and those are those people in the cancer patients networks who just, they show up and it's like, you're going to be happy today and we're going to do these fun things and you don't have a choice. And it's like, well, in reality, a cancer diagnosis and treatment is months, sometimes years long, and then into survivorship can be decades. There are going to be good days and bad days. And I don't always want a happiness warrior telling me it's time for me to be happy. Some days I just want to be mopey and sad and angry. And I just want someone to be pissed off at the world with me. And like, that's perfectly okay. And so this all ties back eventually though. And maybe it's a little bit ironic, or maybe, as a communication professor, so much of what is considered like good communication is focused on like, what's the thing that I say? And I hear that from the supporters as well. But what do I say? And even if I know what to say, how do I say it? That's really missing the point altogether. That's still focusing on you. It's the problem in the room is cancer. It's not that you don't know what to say about cancer. It's the fact that your friend or your family member has cancer. So if that's what you're stuck on, what you really need to be doing is asking the right questions to open up space for the cancer patient, your friend, your loved one, to have that conversation. And those are where those empathy starters that Juli mentioned earlier come into play. Something like, what has this experience been like for you? Especially don't fall for the trap of like, oh, you had leukemia or you have leukemia, so did my father or so did my colleague or whatever. Just say, I'm so sorry to hear that. And I know that everyone's cancer experiences are so different. What has it been like for you right now? Most people going through this have not had that opportunity without any kind of preconceived notions or assumptions from their supporters to just have a blank slate that they can fill up with their own experiences, emotions, thoughts, worries, uncertainties. Let them guide the conversation. So at the end of the day, it's relatively simple, at least at first, is can you ask the right questions that allows that person to have the space to talk? And if they don't want to talk, they're going to tell you. They'll let you know, and you can try again another time.
Thank you so much. I love that. Can you give a couple more examples if there are any other like empathy starters? Because I thought that was really, really great, the few that y'all have provided.
Yeah, so some of these, I'm glad you asked that because there's some distinctions that I want to point out that can really make a difference. Just like a couple words can really make a difference. And this also, by the way, applies to if you have a friend going through a divorce or they've lost their job or anything like that. But anything that's like a long drawn out process. So you can ask someone going through cancer, how are you doing? That's a kind of basic question. So you're going to get a pretty basic response, which is, I'm fine, or I'm struggling, but it's probably not going to be very explanatory. It's going to kind of cut off short. That's why just adding that, how are you doing today? Like, how has today been? Gives them this space to say, well, you know, this has been a tough process and chemo absolutely sucks, but today's been a good day. You know, like my favorite rerun of New Girl came on, and you know, I made myself like my favorite snack, and you know, today's been good, but it's a struggle. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe things are going really well, and they say, you know, overall, I'm responding well to treatment, but I tell you, today I've just been exhausted. I've been emotionally worn out, and it's just been a really bad day. And so you'll be surprised if you just add that little you know, little extra clause at the end of how are you doing today or right now. And that can really make a difference. So we oftentimes tell people, if you have no idea what to say in these situations, these are your like tools in your toolkit that you can whip out right away. One of the most surefire things you can do, even buys you a little bit of time before you decide where you're going to go next, is just to say, I am so sorry to hear this has happened to you. And then just to get that out there, because a lot of people don't even say that. So I'm so sorry this has happened to you. What has that been like for you today? Or what has this been like for you so far? Or how do you think this has been a unique experience to you? These are all, you know, really basic ways to start that conversation. And it's going to set, like I said, such a different tone, as opposed to, you have cancer, that sucks. My dad passed away from cancer. That must be so scary. What can I'm going to come over and cook you dinner, and that's just so much, right? And that might not be what the person needs. So do some investigative work, ask questions, and let them guide the conversation. That's like at a high level, just what I would recommend across the board.
Thank you so much. What came up for me is, I think that as we know, every cancer experience is so unique, because I've even had experiences working with survivors where like they don't want to hear I'm sorry again, but it's like you wouldn't know that unless you were intimately close with them and like really attuned to their unique needs. And that's why these conversations are so important, because even if you show up with that as a starting point, then it's kind of like going back to the two-way street. Then it's on them to be like, you know what, I don't want your pity today. And however that comes out, because I've heard that before too. But it's like better than saying nothing. And so I think those are really helpful tips. Brendan, I want to go back to kind of your story about how, you know, disclosing your diagnosis in the workplace, really kind of being fearful about the way that two-way traffic jam would look from a place of an employer and employee relationship. Did you struggle personally with that honest and clear, like how did that story evolve for you? And did your employer have empathy? And how have you taken your experience and used it to kind of break down barriers in the workplace in particular surrounding a diagnosis? Oh, you're muted. Perfect.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call without someone doing that. So when I was first diagnosed, apart from telling, you know, a few friends, family, and my girlfriend at the time, Corinne, I decided initially to keep it hidden at work. I spoke to my immediate boss, who was, you know, Colter would have loved him. Textbook perfect. I'm so sorry this has happened. What you need from me is your boss right now. And one thing we discussed initially was we would keep it very private. He wouldn't tell anyone unless I gave the green light to, just to see how that initial treatment would pan out. And that initial treatment was quite difficult because my white blood cell count was very high. I reacted poorly or appropriately, depending how you look at it, to the treatment. So it became a real struggle at work with fatigue, just body aches, nausea, and so on. So I found that I was being very irritable because I was a manager with my staff, that I was underperforming because I was still trying to act as if there was nothing wrong with me, that this was just something I could deal with deal with a couple of pills and all will be fine. I'm guessing 2-3 months into my treatment, I realized, A, that this was a long-term situation. It was going to be very chronic. And secondly, being inauthentic at work wasn't helpful. So my employer, the United Nations at the time, has fantastic policies in place. And I guess this is the same as some big organizations. There's great policies in place, but how those policies play out with people with chronic illnesses in practice is very different. And so, as I said, when I spoke to the UN doctor who looks after sort of the clearances for staff to work or to get sick leave, he was adamant. He said, if you tell people you have cancer, your career's over, because no manager wants to have someone on their team who's sick. So even if you're well today, there's always this fear that, is my staff member in my team going to need to take 1, 2 weeks off, 3 weeks off? Are they going to go on extended sick leave? They're going to, be so ill as to have to leave, and then I've got a vacancy I have to fill. So for a lot of managers, it became a situation of discrimination. They didn't want me to work for them because they feared that I would become a burden to them. So I actually became the best manager of my life when I had cancer at work, because I critically stripped away things that I deemed not essential, and I delegated much more than I ever had, which my subordinates loved because it empowered them. And I had a system with my direct reports, which we basically called green flag, red flag, where they would come in and look at me and they'd say, "How's today, boss?" And I'd say, "Red flag day." They go, "Okay." And they gave me space, didn't push things on me unless it was really urgent. And other days I'd say, "Oh, it's a green flag day." And they would go, "Great, here's a lot of work I need to look at." So my staff had incredible empathy for me as a manager and what I could and couldn't do. But eventually I realized that I could no longer work. I used to be a humanitarian affairs officer, so I actually got sick with leukemia working in Iraq. And my organization and I realized that I could never go back to doing that sort of work again. So then they became very supportive in the sense of allowing me to have more and more time off, ended up going to New York for treatment, and eventually took a disability pension, which my employer is very generous about, which is, unlike the social security system where you only get the benefits if you cannot work, my pension is, I couldn't do my old job anymore, so I couldn't be employed by them. So they gave me an early retirement. But the key takeaways for me was that having a boss that was incredibly supportive enabled me to do what I eventually did. If I had a boss that was not supportive or antagonistic about my diagnosis, I don't know what my outcome would have been in terms of work. I found being authentic was the most appropriate response. And even though I wanted to hide it, perhaps even call it like cancer shame, being out and open about it was actually the best course of action. And I know that each country and each state's law is a little bit different, but for me, a cancer diagnosis and having cancer and cancer treatment is a disability. It does affect how you go about your daily life. It does affect your ability to work. And I think people should look at what the ADA says and what the protections are for you as you talk to your employer about your diagnosis and the treatment that's required.
I'm so glad that's an example of a situation where that transparency and authenticity really paid huge dividends. That's incredible and very encouraging probably for several people listening in. So thank you so much for sharing. That actually is a great lead into our next kind of section, our final section of this webinar before we dig into Q&A, where we're going to provide additional tips and techniques for what to say, what not to say, when to listen, how to listen, and to navigate around these difficult conversations. So Juli, would love to start with you because we've talked a lot about when clear and honest communication goes well, but let's talk about the flip side of that, when it breaks down, because cancer is really tough, and we've all been there where we don't say the right thing. And they sometimes have a tendency to spiral out of control or build up over time. And that awkwardness just intensifies, which doesn't help anybody. So because this authenticity and this transparency that we've just talked about is so difficult, what are some strategies for overcoming fear for even, going for it in the first place, and creating a safe space to, one, be honest with each other, and then to bridge the gap or reapproach if we might mess up?
That's such a great question. One, I think whenever there's like a thorny conversation or we feel uncomfortable, if there's anxiety, that just feeds avoidance behavior. So we just kind of, maybe if I just don't look at it, maybe if I just don't mention it, it'll kind of go away, but then it doesn't go away. And then what happens is like a few days go by and I'm feeling really awkward about even like texting my friend back. So maybe I'm just avoiding them. Maybe I just like see them, their name light up on my phone and I just turn it over. So just looking at those cues, if you're feeling that way, that's probably an indication, one, that yes, something awkward is going on, or maybe there's a conflict, and it's a key to address it in whatever way you need to address it, because just that avoidance in and of itself will just make the awkwardness grow, which will make kind of the conflict, could make it feel worse. So giving yourself permission to address it. I love what Brendan said about kind of what he was doing with his team, where he said, I'm having a red flag day, or this is a blue flag day. I mean, sometimes when it comes to working through conflict with loved ones, it can be useful to just kind of set that boundary. Gosh, conflict is kind of part of life, but if anything's uncomfortable between us, we're just going to say, we're going to have a word, that is just kind of like, we've hit a bump in the road, whatever it is. So that's kind of a common language. It's a way to then communicate about it. So it makes it maybe not as scary, and that oftentimes things probably feel worse to us and we kind of blow them up in our mind in terms of what might happen than they actually are. And why do we feel awkward, or why do we avoid? Probably because we care about somebody and maybe we messed up, we feel bad about it, we don't know what to say. So the other piece is starting with self-compassion for yourself. Like, no, everybody's human. Nobody's going to be perfect. Sometimes we might avoid it because we have so much shame, or we feel like we've been a bad friend. You might have said the wrong thing. That doesn't make you a bad friend or a bad person. So kind of looking at that distinction. And then when you do approach the person, kind of approaching it, in a caring way, and leaving room for their experience. I care about you so much. And I said something the other day that I really regretted. I think that maybe you can let me know, but I think that maybe you felt a little awkward, or maybe you felt angry with me, and I'm so sorry,
Yeah, that's tough. Oh, in all areas of life, right?
Absolutely.
That ability and really that empathy that we're talking about to bridge that gap.
And I think just talking about feelings, and especially anger, right? Or, conflict. I think that oftentimes those are just kind of things that maybe we didn't even grow up in our families knowing kind of how to approach in certain ways, or maybe it was really scary, or it just seemed like if we just turned away from it, it would just kind of get swept under the rug.
Yeah, that makes sense. Colter, in your work and research, are there any additional pitfalls that you've personally seen in communications post-diagnosis? And do you have any additional advice to share with the audience on navigating around these really tricky conversations? Oh.
How about now?
Yep.
All right. I think we've hit most of the major pitfalls, like the most common things. Something that came to me as I was listening to Juli just now was, once someone is into this, right, and it's no longer like the initial shock of how their life is going to drastically change now as a cancer patient, one of the useful things you can do is to check in and ask, well, how has your support system been so far? Like, do you feel like you're getting the support you need? And that's kind of a twofold question. One, it gives them a chance to maybe vent about what they're not getting, but it also gives you an opportunity to find out and do a little bit of digging in terms of what you can do for that person. So maybe they have had a really great network of friends who are, setting up a meal train, and every night of the week they're having dinner brought to them, and that's wonderful. but maybe they don't have that person they can talk to about some of their uncertainties about the ongoing treatment. And so again, asking those questions can allow you as a friend to figure out maybe what you can do to help fill some gaps that person is experiencing in terms of their support needs.
I love that so much, because we've also heard the feedback time and time again of, at first there's so much support and it's so overwhelming. And so if you're able to check in intermittently and ask that question consistently of how's your support doing now? How is it doing now? Because it looks dramatically different from month 1 to month 3 to month 9 to year 3. Like everyone's, experiences, it varies greatly in length and level of support that they want at any given time. So I love that question.
And I'm glad you brought up the timing aspect of it too. I would say, just because my students know what I do and what I study, I would say at least once, if not twice a semester, I have a student come up to me and say, hey, I had a friend who's just diagnosed with cancer, or a family member. But oftentimes it's like someone who's like an acquaintance. So maybe they're in the same school organization and they know this person and they want to reach out, but they're like, I don't know what to say. And I tell them, I'm like, well, what's happening is actually what you just said, is in that first couple weeks, there's usually this outpouring of support, especially if they are public about it on like their social media, right? They just get their inbox just blows up. They have all those notifications and so much love heading their way. And then it tends to drop off like somewhat drastically after the first couple weeks. And we know that that's not the end of a cancer treatment. Typically, it's usually something that's more drawn out than that. And so what I actually tell my students, if it's something that you don't know too well, maybe hold back and wait 2 or 3 weeks, and then just send a message that's like, hey, I remember hearing about this and I've been thinking about you, but I know you're probably also overwhelmed. So I just wanted to wait and give you some space. But I just wanted to say, I'm thinking about you. I care about you. And let me know what I can do to support you. And actually the way I found this out wasn't through my own research. It was through my own life experiences. I had a friend who I'd only met maybe twice. I think our student organizations had like done an event together. And so I really just got to spend like one evening hanging out and chatting with her at this event. And then she later on was diagnosed with a terminal cancer diagnosis. And I waited, 2 or 3 weeks, and I reached out and did just that. And I was expecting honestly no response at all. I thought I'll just throw this out there in the universe, and hopefully it does some good. And she wrote back this incredibly long, really heartfelt, multiple paragraph response, and just saying and expressing essentially what I just said, which is like, I love that you reached out to me. It's so meaningful since we barely know each other that you're thinking about me. And also just because I feel like this tsunami of support has kind of disappeared or dried up after the first month. And it was just one of those moments. I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that as a response, but it was definitely a learning moment and something I thought about later on in the future.
That's amazing. And that wouldn't have happened to begin with if you didn't break through the awkward, because I'm sure there was potentially that story of, I barely know this person. Like, what are they going to think? Is this weird? But you trusted your gut and you're just like, you know what, I'm just going to go for it.
It has a lot to do with expectations. Just like, I definitely went beyond her expectations because she didn't think I was going to reach out, and I did. And on the flip side, that's what we see that's so hurtful, is whenever those people who you would think would reach out, who are your close friends or your work friends, they don't. And then they stand in stark contrast to this person you maybe met for a couple times who thought enough to reach out. And so it's a lot of this is a game of expectations being met or not met.
Absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. Brendan, I would love to take it back to you for a second, because it sounds like you had a lot of support, especially at the beginning of your diagnosis, and as someone who continues to live with cancer. And I think, one, you're just so incredible and resilient, but would love to hear how your support has ebbed and flowed over time, how that communication around what your needs are, and your supporters, how they respond to those. How has that looked over the course of your treatment?
I think firstly, I'll echo what Colter said. Something that has particularly touched me over the years is the people who I thought were, peripheral colleagues, peripheral friends, not through any ill intent, but just circumstances meant we knew each other, but wasn't much more than that. And, getting that periodic message every 3-6 months, checking in, it's been really nice and has actually developed good long distance relationships with these people. And I think one of the things that I've noticed a lot that has changed for me is that at that initial diagnosis, the spotlight is all about the cancer. In fact, I'm standing in the wings of the stage and everyone's looking at the cancer and it's all about the cancer. And Brendan's barely recognizable when we talk about the cancer. And the cancer's still there, but over time, the conversation shifts away from it, and probably naturally as it does, because it becomes a chronic condition. To it almost becomes something that's never talked about. And certainly for me, and I imagine a lot of other people who have cancer for a long time, the disability or the condition is very invisible. So I personally suffer from, chronic fatigue, ups and downs in energy levels, good days and bad days with bone pain. And most of it, we adjust because it becomes the new normal. And then sometimes we get offended, or I personally do, when people have expectations for me to do more than I can. Or if I get irritable, I'm also not very good at communicating my own needs. But I find that there's a lack of empathy over time because you're expected to just get over it or adjust to it. So that has been sort of a hallmark for me in terms of understanding it over the longer term. I'll probably have more to say to this after Colter and Juli have a chat. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah. Any additions to that?
I mean, I guess just coming back to kind of one thing that came to me as we're all talking about how to cope with those awkward moments. I think one thing that can be useful is to kind of do some grounding. Awkward, it's just a feeling. I mean, not to like diminish it, but it's like just a feeling, but if we kind of, it feels so big, we can really, it can like feel like it's sitting in the driver's seat of kind of, and controlling everything. So just like anxiety, if we feel anything, it's just a feeling. And sometimes that can just like create a little bit of space between the feelings so that we don't feel so, hesitant to reach out.
Something that just popped into my head was anytime I had an awkward moment with Kirsten, she was the funniest person anyone will ever meet. So she would always insert humor, which was amazing, like comedic relief for both of us. But is humor appropriate as not only a coping mechanism, but also as a communication tool? And when should that potentially be leveraged? Like only if it feels organic? Or what are your thoughts on humor kind of as part of breaking through that awkward?
I think that depends on the person, I think that if like your friend, that's like their go-to and it's like really therapeutic for them. And that's kind of a way to connect and to communicate about something tough, then that's great. But if it's like, they're maybe more serious minded and you're coming in kind of making a joke about it, then it could feel a little bit, insensitive perhaps to the other person.
That makes sense. And I think of what Colter says, even with the happiness warrior, I was thinking of like a clown warrior, someone coming in like, I got all the jokes on deck. We're going to get through today.
Yeah, it's you got to handle that delicately. The most recent time that I had a kind of this intense of a level conversation was with a friend who lost a family member to suicide, and obviously not a joking matter, but our relationship through a lot of things that we've gone through in each of our lives, we've always been able to find some actual humor in that situation. And so 55, 60 minutes into that conversation, I won't get into the details, but I kind of made like a sarcastic comment, and it really worked to lighten the mood and to like kind of reestablish like this is how we are as a friendship, right? And It's obviously a terrible time, but it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be all serious, but you have to be really careful about that use of humor, because especially if you're not like, if you're already kind of not feeling like you're adept communicatively, maybe hang off on that for a bit, because even as someone who studies this for a living, I was like on the fence about it. Do I want to make a joke right now? And it worked, but it was risky. So I mean, I would, again, it just depends on the person. Myself and that friend are also the type of people who believe that almost any situation, if you step back, can have a humorous aspect to it, even if it's just a minor one.
And that, again, that point just goes to reiterate the truth that everyone's, not only their experience, but everyone is so unique. And so what they need, and that's why this clear communication is so incredibly vital. And if you go for it and, think humor might be supportive and then it's not, you can leverage some of the tools that we laid out earlier in this webinar to approach and say, hey, I think I messed up. My experience of this is that you got angry, understandably, because I messed up. Like, let's revisit, let's try again. And we're going to jump into audience Q&A in about 5 minutes, which I'm really excited for, but I would love to take a couple of minutes before we do that to explicitly lay out some key phrases our audience members, especially those supporters listening in, might want to avoid. And so, Brendan, I actually think of you here because with ongoing treatment, you may have heard, with that waning empathy that you speak of, you may have heard like, oh, but you don't look like you have cancer, or things like that, right? Which just I don't know, for me, that would make my blood boil. And so what feedback can you personally provide to comments like that, regardless of maybe how well-intentioned they are?
I would say, don't say that.
Facts.
It's across all disabilities. A friend I follow on Twitter posted how she's visually impaired, and someone said to her today, "You're a great swimmer for someone who's blind." So I think you don't need to say you don't look sick, you don't look blind, whatever it is. You don't need to comment on how someone looks. And the other thing I'll just add, to go back a minute if you don't mind, something else I found very useful about the communication side and dealing with this long term is don't be scared to get therapy if it's available for you. 6 or so months into my diagnosis, I saw a therapist who actually really enabled me to communicate much more effectively about cancer, because I couldn't do it on my own. And I think often people with cancer feel that it is only about them and their oncologist. Well, really it is a support team. It's you, your pharmacist, your oncologist, and ideally if you have a therapist, if you need it. It was invaluable for dealing with depression and the anxiety around having cancer.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for bringing up that resource, especially in the era that we're in now, thank God, which is the, really breaking stigmas around mental health, having these tough conversations around mental health. And it's, normalizing the fact that we all go through seasons of our life where we really need that support, and a therapist or any health professional in that regard can be a vital point or part of that support network. So thank you for highlighting that. One thing I do want to ask about, going back really quickly to key phrases to avoid. Colter, in your work, I know we've talked about this, you've noted starting a conversation with at least this is often shared, but it's a total train wreck waiting to happen, right? And so is there anything else that comes to mind? Either Juli, Colter, weigh in. We have about like 1 minute before we jump to audience Q&A, of anything else that maybe, if we start something with at least, maybe we stop in our tracks, take that empathy pause, and then try to start what we're saying.
Yeah, go ahead, Juli.
Oh,
no, you do.
One thing I would say that might kind of fit with that at least is, I know exactly how you feel. I mean, even though like we might say that and be well-meaning and empathic, we really don't know how somebody else feels, like everybody's experience is their experience. And so, kind of rephrasing that, kind of repurpose that, let me know how you feel. How's it going for you? Go ahead, Colter.
You pretty much, I mean, I laughed because it was pretty much the exact same thing. It's just in general, don't assume you know anything about what this person is going through, even if you have been through what you think is a similar experience because it's the same type of cancer, or you might go through a similar treatment. It hits everybody differently. And so try not to say, well, this reminds me of my, my cousin who had this, and then just don't do that. Ask the right questions and let them tell you what they're going through and what they're experiencing. That's as simple as it is.
What I'm hearing over and over again, the words that keep coming to my mind is like, we're space holders, kind of as the supporters. It's just also just holding space for the experience. And that's, do y'all agree with that? Or is that just me being?
No, I think at least through the psychological literature and some of the communicative literature on support, the actually receiving support is somewhat tied to health outcomes, but the perception of available support is the much stronger correlation. And so people who consistently believe that they have a lot of people they could turn to, that actually tends to be more strongly correlated to actual physical and mental health outcomes. And so that's exactly what you're doing. If you're offering yourself as space, you are saying that you are available, and that bolsters this person's perception of who they can turn to if they need help.
That's so powerful. That's incredible, because it's just even showing, I mean, obviously you show up as a supporter with the intention to come in and support as needed, but even just being there and knowing, having the survivor know that you're somebody they can count on, that in itself is what shifts that, the health outcomes, as you just noted, which is crazy and amazing.
I think the other thing I'd add is I think that, with cancer, whether or not or the death of a loved one or any kind of, difficult kind of, thing we encounter in life, the thing that lingers is that people tend to feel very alone. And so I think that, kind of when we look at trauma research through psychology, one of the things that can be so healing is just being a witness, just being present with that person's experience. Mm-hmm. And, like at Empathy Boot Camp, we kind of say kindness is your credential. And so that goes a long way. Just showing up goes a long way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Anything to add, Brendan, before we move on to some of these questions?
Well, I'm happy for the questions. Thanks.
Okay, sounds great. So we have approximately, 15 to 20 minutes, several questions to get through. So I'm just going to throw these out there and we can popcorn around. And if you have something to add, please add. Okay, so this is a good one. How does our personality and the way we communicate impact how we convey difficult situations? Does understanding how others communicate help with these interactions? So personality specific, as we talked about, everyone's unique. Can anyone add additional color on that?
One interesting thing that is kind of on deck for my own research is looking at cancer patients and how some tend to have the type of personality that really keeps track of who has reached out and how well they've done, and other people are much less scorekeepers. They typically are just appreciative of almost everything that they receive. And that's just a pattern that I've seen. But beyond that, I would actually probably yield over to Juli, who has more of the official psychological background, to talk about personality differences.
It's interesting. We talk about this a little bit kind of in our empathy work, because everybody just responds maybe to stress, right? Or to things that are upsetting a little bit differently. Some people might want to naturally avoid it because it's scary. Some people might become really anxious. So maybe they rush in and want to do a lot for somebody before they even know what that person needs. So I think those kind of differences can play out in kind of how we show up, how we feel when someone's having a tough time. And then also that, your friend's cancer diagnosis, or, whatever somebody's going through, that's probably not the first tough thing they faced in their life. What's the rest of their story, and how does it intersect with this experience? I think that more than anything plays a big role in how things play out, not only for the person who has cancer, but maybe also for the person who's supporting them. If your friend has cancer and you lost a parent to cancer when you were very young, you might feel very different about that than you know, if this was the first person ever that shared this type of, you know, this news with you. So I think all of those kind of individual threads can make, you know, play a big role.
And we just received another question that's great. That's a really powerful follow on, because I feel we've talked a lot about words and the impact of words throughout this session. And Lori mentions it's more than just words, it's actions too. Her son went through a cancer experience, 21, and struggled with friends who were uncomfortable to commit, to do things they wouldn't show, they never acknowledged it. And so how do we have any advice for those listening in who maybe they don't necessarily struggle with the words, or they make commitments, but the action and the follow through is missing? Like, how can we speak into that a little bit? Personally, I just want to be like, just show up, just do what you're supposed to do. But it's challenging because at Be Present, we work specifically with young adults and adolescents with cancer. And so understandably, this time in your life, it's, you know, so busy, it's formative, it's something where the last thing sometimes on your mind is a cancer diagnosis. So something that came up actually, Colter, when you were talking about checking in, not just, you know, at the time of diagnosis or in the flurry after, is that I would set phone reminders and calendar reminders on my phone. Even though Kirsten was one of my best friends, I knew that in the wake of midterms, potentially it would slip my mind to check in. And so I, you know, would have random just alerts, and, you know, that's just checking in. But then we had a non-negotiable every single Tuesday. I was there, and that was kind of like the set date. Admittedly, I didn't always do the best job, you know, but I think it's challenging because in my experience in my generation, I'm 26, is that we're kind of non-committal as a whole, and that's frustrating. And so from an expert perspective, would love to hear your thoughts.
That's a really good question. I think the initial silence from the panel that shows how there's some thinking that has to go into that. I think if you are the person who's experiencing a lot of people not showing up, you have to kind of first make that decision. Like, is it worth it to bring this up and to express that you are feeling disappointment? And if you do, then just like most other conflict communication, you want to state what it is that's bothering you, but also why it's bothering you. Like how that makes you feel. Now, the other thing though, with like the non-committal, especially if you're younger, you're adolescent, what I think about is like, if I was a parent and I had like a 15-year-old son whose friend is going through cancer, and my son didn't want to be a good supporter or be along for that ride, I would encourage that person, my hypothetical son, to do that, because there was going to be so many times in your life where you do have to be that supporter for someone, and you shouldn't just always shy away. So yeah, maybe you've never dealt with something like this before, but when you're 15, that might be a good time to learn how do you support someone through a really tough situation. Because guess what? Maybe you go to college and you have a roommate who goes through a death in the family, or you have a spouse later in life who is really torn up about losing a parent. I mean, it's just part of the human experience to be there for people and to support them through various crappy situations. And so there just has to be a point in your life where you learn it. And so I don't know, I'm approaching getting on a soapbox at this point.
And the learning is messy. Like, what I keep thinking of, like, this is messy. It's not, it's like the progress versus perfection, right? Like we're not going to get it right at first because it's learning.
It's that learning curve where, like, even if you, after a webinar like this, you might feel like you have the tools, and then the first time you try them out, it doesn't go well, right? That doesn't mean you should just ditch all the tools. It means, next time maybe you'll phrase that question a little bit better, or your intonation or your nonverbals will be a little bit better. And it's do your best, and you'll get better over time if you are consistently practicing being good being a good supporter.
I think it can also be helpful to just kind of zoom out. Even if you haven't supported a friend, through cancer, you've probably supported somebody in your life. What are the ways that you show up when people are struggling? Name 3 kind of gestures. Do you like to send flowers? Do you like to set a phone date? Do you like to go over and spend time with somebody? Make a list of those 3 things and then, communicate. I'd like to do one of these 3 things, or do any of them sound like they'd be supportive for you? So know that you don't have to reinvent your wheel of kindness. There's probably things that you already know how to do, and you can kind of, apply those things to see if they'll work for your friend.
The other thing I'd like to add to what Juli and Colter have said is that as part of that support network is that if you feel uncomfortable communicating with the person with cancer, but you have a friend, both of you can get involved in terms of that, providing that support. And also means that there's more of a conversation happening with 3 of you rather than 2 of you. And also, if you have a friend going through cancer and you have common acquaintances, you can also be a silent advocate. You can also say to your friend, John or Mary or Abdul, hey, have you checked in with Mary? I heard she's still undergoing treatment. When did you last speak to her? Because sometimes just that little reminder to someone, we're like, oh yeah, I've been so busy. Yeah, I'll drop her a line. That can also help as well.
I love that advice. I can, as a testament to my own experience, that was really powerful. Because not only did we, Kirsten, myself, and a few of her really close friends have a group chat, we also then had a group, text message going with just the supporters, and would check in to make sure that we were providing that consistent support amongst us, because sometimes it can feel really heavy, especially, and I don't want to say, young adults, but especially as a young adult when it feels so big because you're learning how to deal with these really uncomfortable things for maybe the first time in your life. It can feel really heavy if you feel like it's just on you to provide that type of support. So I love that. Okay, are we ready for next question? Okay, cool. So saying no and setting boundaries is really hard, but important for both the patient and supporter. What are some strategies for being honest and handling potential negative responses or people taking the boundary feedback personally? Colter, I have to go to you first.
Yes, exactly.
I had an experience recently I'll share, just with some pretty major negative events in my own life. It wasn't cancer, but other kind of big things. And a family member was disappointed in my not sharing what was happening. And they expressed eventually that they were really getting upset with me for not sharing updates. And I kind of snarkily said, well, imagine living through these things, right? Like, you're upset because you're not getting updates. Imagine going through all this. And it was kind of a harsh thing to say, but it set a boundary. And I think personally, and I'm curious what Brendan thinks about this, I think personally, the closer you are to the core of the situation, the more liberty you have to act like that. So if you are the cancer patient, you by all means can be very blunt and say, like, I am not talking about this right now. And if you are maybe that person, that cancer patient's spouse, or like mom or dad or son or daughter, you probably have a lot of liberty too, with almost anyone, to say the same. But the further you get away from that core person who actually is battling cancer, the more you probably need to yield to the inner core of people. And that's just been, those are my thoughts. That's not backed up by any research. So I'm really curious what Brendan thinks about that.
I actually fully agree in terms of, my wife, she has carte blanche to say what she needs to say anytime. Whether I'll be receptive or not is a different matter. Whereas I would never expect to tolerate that from people more on the periphery, even if they are good acquaintances or good friends. And similarly, and it did take me a while to learn this through my diagnosis, is that eventually when people did say things to me that were either clearly offensive or upsetting or something that I thought was inappropriate, I would just sort of say, sorry, enough. Or I don't speak French, but I would say arrête, like stop, basta, And I just found it easier to say that rather than trying to explain why I'm offended. It's just easier to say no.
Yeah.
And then they would get upset because I was upset at their comment, but you have to live with that.
I think you just have the right. I think that's part of, like, if you're the person going through chemo, you also have the right to just cut off any conversation pretty much at any point. I think that you just have that right personally. But
It's really interesting because Lori, who asked the question earlier, followed up in the chat and said, I found my son ended up supporting others a lot, working to make them comfortable. Colter's point is well taken. We tend to shy away from uncomfortable situations, but it's so crazy because I feel that's so accurate and spot on, where the survivor ends up feeling like they need to support the supporters. And while the topic of the title of this webinar is it's a two-way street, it's like, yes, it's a two-way street when it comes to open communication, but insofar as support, that's where it gets like, no, you, as you know, you're the core person closest to that kind of situation. I feel like, yeah, you have the flexibility, freedom, and understandably so, the, you know, just to be able to say, here are my needs, and they get to come first. Any other thoughts on that, Julie, before we move to the next question?
I mean, I guess I'll circle back to the question, you know, around if you set a boundary and then somebody takes it personally. I mean, for all of us to know that like most things are not personal, you know, and boundaries are not rejection. They're a form of protection, a way to kind of maintain our own sense of safety. So kind of redefining what a boundary is can really help how we experience the boundary.
I agree with that entirely. I think boundaries are tricky in any situation, but especially I think here, but it's encouraging, I think, to have even conversations like this where we can set, like it sounds, Brendan, like you just know, just like, if you don't know what to say, it's like, that's like the hardest line of a boundary of just, nope, nada. If you want to say it in French, go for it, right? But that's really helpful. So, okay, next question. Ooh, this is a good one. Physical changes, whether they're temporary or permanent, tend to impact how a person sees us when we get cancer. Do you have any tips on how to mitigate this?
Yes. I mean, again, every cancer diagnosis and treatment is different, but I discovered that people have a preconceived notion of what a cancer person should look like, or person undergoing cancer treatment should look like. So it's like, why aren't you losing your hair? You look well. Why are you smiling? How can you smile? You've just been diagnosed with cancer. One New Year's Eve, I slept in the afternoon and went out in anticipation of a good night and partying until about 4 a.m, dancing, had a good time, exhausted for the next 2 days. And I posted some photos on social media, and some friends came back commenting like, get those offline. You're supposed to have cancer. How can you be out dancing until 4 a.m? People will think you're faking it. It's like, oh my God, the theatre of the sick. You have to look ill to make people feel comfortable. And I have no answer for how to deal with that other than to be authentic. But people do have a perception of how you should look and how you should behave with cancer. And if you don't meet that expectation, it can really confuse them.
I think that's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, I will restrain because I just don't think I have an answer, unfortunately.
I think that the biggest thing though, Brendan, and you just highlighted, is like that's a normal experience. And so sometimes even if we don't have a solution, just normalizing the fact that that experience is so widespread and you're not alone if you're going through that. And those, you know, awkward barriers, whether or not caused by physical changes, changes in mental health or emotional states, it's very real, and it's okay. It's okay, right? It's okay to have that. It's not ideal by any means. And if there are ways to bridge those gaps, I think it's person to person. So like I can speak from my experience with Kirsten, the way that she did that, and, you know, for herself was buying the fun wigs and doing makeup. And we really enjoyed that. And that created also a way of creating connection between us when we had spent time together. But I think, again, it's something that I wish that people, when they got that diagnosis, didn't feel the need to change anything about appearance. But Yes, it's again, I'm struggling. I don't have words because it's part of the experience where it's like, it's awkward and uncomfortable, and unfortunate.
I wonder if it's maybe symptomatic of a deeper need that I've seen in my research, where oftentimes when I'm interviewing cancer patients, there's this tension, this between two competing sides of I want to be treated normally, like my pre-cancer self, and versus you have to treat me specially or differently because I have cancer. And it's amazing, and re-listening to some of those transcripts to hear both those sides of the equation be spoken within like 30 seconds of each other from the same person, right? And so there's this competing desire for like, I am who I am. I'm still that person. I've just been diagnosed with this. And then very much so, I'm also going through a very unique, stressful situation. And I wonder if that ties into that question as maybe like a deeper underlying desire that's occurring.
That lands so hard for me, at least. How do you reconcile those two narratives that are so seemingly conflicting, but also so incredibly valid?
Yeah, I think the lesson here is if you're a really good supporter and you're around a person enough and you are present with that person and available enough, then there will be plenty of times for you to treat them normally, quote unquote, like their pre-cancer selves. And then there's plenty of times to treat them as a person who's going through this very difficult situation. I think it's hard if you're that person who's just going to show up one time, check the box and say, I'm done, I was a good supporter. But if you're around, once a week or something like that, you'll realize this is the type of day where they just want to go out and dance until 4 a.m. And that's cool. And there's going to be other times whenever they don't, and they want to maybe have a deep conversation about their uncertainties and fears. And so if you're going to try to meet both needs, you have to be there more than once, probably, is probably what it turns into.
Yeah. So it's consistency and support at that point as well. And presence. At Be Present, we are all about presence.
Makes sense.
Just be present.
Hopefully that kind of answers that question. That's my best shot at it.
I love that. Well, we are about to wrap up, but Juli, Brendan, want to hand it over to both of you. Colter as well, if you have one piece of advice that the audience listening in, whether they're probably primarily supporters listening into this one, or a survivor, is there anything that you really feel they should leave with today?
I'll go first then. Be authentic, because you're never going to escape who you are pre-cancer, whether you're a supporter or the person with cancer. And actually be present in a way that works for you. And if you combine being present and being authentic, hopefully you'll get it right.
And I guess I would add, just kind of we're all human, so it's okay to make mistakes. That doesn't ruin a relationship. Sometimes that can make a relationship stronger. You become closer because you work through it, and that's part of building intimacy.
And I'll close out by saying that even though being a good communicator might seem like someone who knows just the right thing to say, it's oftentimes about being a better listener, and a big part of that is asking the right questions.
I think one thing I'm taking out of this is that it's not just about the words we say, it's also how we show up and the space that we hold, and that consistency of support and just making ourselves available, because everyone has a responsibility in this. Again, it's a two-way street, a two-way traffic jam. But this, my friends, is the recipe to really opening ourselves up to deeper, more authentic, meaningful connections, especially in the face of cancer. So in conclusion, I just want to thank each and every one of you for your valuable expertise. I had such a blast facilitating this discussion, which is saying a lot considering the topic, because it can be very heavy. And I just appreciate all of you for showing up and working with me and with our audience to really overcome some of these barriers. And it's a really meaningful discussion to lead. So to stay connected with you all, I'd love for each of you to share the best way to reach out to you or learn more about your organization. Juli, do you want to go first?
Yes, you can reach out to me via my website in terms of psychology, which is just www.drjuli, Juli, Fraga, Fraga, empathybootcamp.com. And if you want to learn more about the work that Colter and I do with Empathy Bootcamp, you can also just Google Empathy Bootcamp, and it's empathybootcamp.com.
Awesome. What about you, Brendan?
People can learn more about myself and Uncomfortable Revolution in our magazine, which is just simply urevolution.com. And if they want to learn more about the book, it's called Glossary of Awkward. And if you type that into Google, you'll find it.
Awesome. And we will provide, I was just reminded, we'll provide all the links in the replay as well. So that's exciting. Colter, what about you?
Yeah, the benefit of having a unique name is if you put me into Google, you will find me very quickly. So I do have a website, colterray.com, and you can learn more about my research. I just publicly post all my research. I don't try to hide it behind a paywall or anything because I don't like that. I haven't been told not to do that yet, so we'll see. And then there's also links on that website over to the Empathy Bootcamp side of things as well.
Awesome. Thank you again for sharing your time and wisdom. A special thank you to everyone who tuned in just for being here and taking your time to learn. We hope you received some valuable nuggets of information. I know I did. I'm going to be watching the replay myself actually and taking some notes. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, Be Present's next webinar will be on August 18th. So be sure to mark your calendars. The topic is specific to rallying a support squad around young adults. So if this is relevant to you, make sure to tune in. In the meantime, I have to give a little plug for Be Present. So you can connect with me and our team on social media at BePresent.org. That's the single letter B, no E, no special characters or spaces, or you can learn more about us at be-present.org. It's been such a pleasure again to facilitate this discussion, and we can't wait to see you again soon. That's a wrap. We're a minute over, but we're here. Have a great rest of your evening, everyone, and thanks so much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.